Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Peter Forrest, Dean of Humanities for Thales College. Peter holds a PhD in philosophy from Oxford University and enjoys exploring intellectual treasures together with the bright and pioneering students of Thales College. Peter, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Great to be here.
I'm really excited about our conversation today, in part because I am not a philosopher. I've taught a couple of history of philosophy survey courses, and my students always tell me I'm a philosopher, and I have to tell them, nope, I am not a philosopher. I'm a history major who can read Kant and at least try to piece him together, but I don't actually philosophize in that way. But you actually are a philosopher. So I'm really excited what you can share with us today.
If you can piece Kant together, then that's better than most philosophers, I think, actually. So you're ahead of the game.
Well, there we go. Today, I know the problem we're looking at today seems like something that has become more important in recent days. I was thinking about these topics. It seems like artificial intelligence is now everywhere. Everybody wants to know, how can I incorporate AI into my business? I don't know that anyone I've not heard any serious reflection yet on whether we should incorporate AI into businesses. It seems like everybody's like, oh, let's just do it, and we'll figure that out. Last week, I saw articles about Elon Musk's new venture, Neuralink. Maybe it's been around. I didn't know about it, but he's ready. He's trying to recruit volunteers who will let him put brain chips in them. And he's got over 20,000 people who've applied. And I've been watching Amazon's show, Upload, which is all about this digital afterlife, where, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more, but how many people would voluntarily choose to give up their bodies, give up their lives, to live in a virtual experience? So all of that is set up. Can you walk us through the mind-body problem, and why is that increasingly important today?
Sure. So, the mind-body problem is a kind of perennial philosophical problem that's been around for millennia. I guess the simplest definition is just the mystery of how the mind and the body interact. So, is the mind identical to the brain, right? Is it nothing more than the brain? Is the relationship between the mind and the brain roughly analogous to, say, you hear this, and this is relevant to talking of AI, for instance, is the mind like the software and the brain is like the hardware? Or are these completely two distinct things, right? So, is there a soul? Why is it important? I think there's a couple of things. One is the relationship between the mind-body problem and what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which has been around this is something coined by a philosopher named David Chalmers, Australian philosopher, in the mid-90s. But there's sort of an interest in this problem for a couple of decades, which is, can we, in purely physical terms, so using the tools of modern physical sciences, explain consciousness in particular? And if not, what does that tell us? Spoiler alert, I think the answer is no. So the majority of philosophers who are particularly sort of secular mainstream philosophers think that you can, because they think that all of reality can be explained in terms of physical terms, or at least they hope so. Chalmers, who himself is a completely secular agnostic person, argues that you can't explain consciousness purely in terms of the physical sciences. And he's won more, it's still a minority view, I'd say, but he's won many more people over to that view. So, one significance of this whole area of thinking about the mind or the soul on the one hand and the brain and the body on the other is, if the mind is not reducible or identical to, in some sense, the body or the physical, then what does that tell us about the nature of reality? Like, where does that come from? It looks like science can't explain everything. Right, so this is actually, C.S. Lewis, as he so often was prescient in this case. So if viewers are familiar with his book Miracles, this is part of the argument there. As I recall, I haven't read that book in years, but if you want, we look at history, say, for evidence of miracles, evidence of the supernatural. But Lewis's point is, if you want evidence for the supernatural, just look in your own mind. The mind itself, consciousness, can't be explained in purely physical terms. So that's, I'm sure that raises all sorts of questions. That's one reason why the mind-body problem is really important. The other would be in the area of anthropology, or what's called philosophical or theological anthropology. So the nature of the human person. Are we purely physical things? And if not, are we purely mental things? Is maybe the body isn't essential to us, and this is what Plato thought, right? And so after death, the really important, essential parts of us, float off to a different kind of life, or some combination. Maybe we're a combination of the mind and the body. How does that all work? But this is the kind of claim that, at least I don't know that I can back this up with completely convincing arguments, but we can talk about it. You can see what you think. But my contention is that most of the really big cultural controversies in our society today have to do with philosophical anthropology, the nature of the human person. So everything from transgenderism is an obvious one, but also abortion, euthanasia. So all the controversies in bioethics, but also all the critical race theory. Issues of to what degree is race or gender essential to who I am? Is it really, really important, or is it a secondary thing? Or do we have more in common, arguably than we have that separates us, if we're across gender or races? And obviously all the things to do with technology. The nature of the state is another one. So individual rights versus to what degree should the state have the right to intrude on our private lives? All these go into the nature of the person. One way to sort of sum this up is you can't really do ethics without first doing anthropology. So you can't really figure out how we should live or what we should do without first figuring out who we are.
Yeah, you were right. There's a lot to follow up on there. I'm just going to pick kind of two. I kept making notes as you were describing.
Sorry, let's stop and let you.
No. You were on a roll. I might do three thoughts there, and then before we kind of pick back up with maybe a different question. And when you're talking about your discussion of miracles there from Lewis, takes me back to David Hume, who, if I'm remembering correctly, for Hume, the miracles were a big link in his eventual movement towards epistemological skepticism. And the fact that you couldn't prove the miraculous was really significant for Hume.
Yeah,
I think that was a big part in developing a certain strand of modernity, that we are limited to this frame.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in this idea that the very existence of the mind, and maybe even our phenomenological experience of the mind, because we all experience the mind. Yeah. And I suspect our viewers probably have all had at one point or another the experience of mental fatigue, where you should be sharp, you should be able to think about something, but you've literally been awake for 22 hours and just the body is done, and until you sleep, you are not going to be able to think in a complex way again. Yeah. It's not a mental thing, it's literally a biological factor. Yeah. And so that the connection there is really interesting.
The relationship between the mind and the body runs both ways, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and explaining how that could work if they're fundamentally different is part of the challenge.
Yeah, I think that even just defining that connection is really interesting. As you were describing that, I kept thinking about all the talk I've heard in the last couple of years about transhumanism, and not distinct from transgender. That's sort of a subset of transhumanism, but when I was a kid, it was purely a pipe dream. It was a science fiction fantasy that we could someday upload the mind to machines, and we could have sort of a mind in a robot body sort of thing. Right. But that no longer seems completely out of reach technologically, but it further raises this whole question, because if your thesis is correct, and if we actually are tied to these bodies, then it would be a sort of suicide to try and elevate the mind into a robot form if the mind is not just some kind of matter that can be transferred. If I understand that all correctly.
Yeah, sure. So I guess we'd have to define what transhumanism is, and I'm hardly an expert in that. But on the one hand, there's the sort of, I think, more down to earth, attainable things, which are like the Neuralink. So the idea of upgrading our current hardware, as it were, our brains, with more, by melding, computer technology with our brains and our bodies in various ways. And that all looks doable, physically possible, but it raises all sorts of ethical questions, right, about the nature, again, of the person and whether this is a good idea. Now, the question of whether it even makes sense that we could upload our minds to a computer program, quite apart from the ethical implications of that, it's not even clear to me that we know what we're talking about, because it really depends on what the mind is. So, if the mind is identical to the brain or is complex arrangements of brain states, then that would be one way in which it'd be suicide. It's not obvious that you could just transfer your mind to some other hardware because, to some degree, your mind is identical to the hardware. If, on the other end of the spectrum, your mind is something like the non-physical soul, then that pretty obviously would be problematic to try to upload, because it's not clear that you would go. I mean, it's possible that God would set it up as such that you could change out the hardware and your non-physical soul would go with a new silicon brain or something like that. But it seems more plausible that would be a kind of suicide. So the only way that it makes sense that I can understand to talk about uploading your mind is if your fundamental assumption of what the mind is it's like a computer program. So this is called a computational theory of mind, or it's a version of what's sometimes called functionalism, to say that mental states are functional states, which is basically just they're input-output states, right? So mental states are defined by certain inputs, most obviously sort of through your senses, and then various complicated causal processes happen in your brain, and then there's certain outputs. And that's all that a mental state is, not unlike a computer program. And if that's the case, then it makes sense that we could upload. But I think there are lots of reasons to reject that picture of the mind.
Well, I think that's probably a good transition to the article you sent me by John Searles.
Yeah.
That article was entitled, "Can Computers Think?" And I thought it was just really, really interesting. I've not read too much modern philosophical writing, and I found his writing very enjoyable. He's clearly a gifted writer. I really liked his last line. He concluded that mental states are biological phenomena. Consciousness, intentionality, subjectivity, and mental causation are all a part of our biological life history, along with growth, reproduction, the secretion of bile, and digestion. That was a great close. He kind of took us from the lofty and abstract down to well, you make bile, and that production of bile is very important for the human body. Peter, walk us through Searles' argument. Why does thinking depend on our organic bodies, the literal tissue of our brains, for Searles?
Right. So I think he's actually wrong about that. So there's a sort of a positive and a negative aspect of his view that he's arguing for. This is a famous paper from the early 80s. This is often called the Chinese room argument. It's funny how both this article and the other one I sent you by Nozick were from the 70s and 80s, and they're very sort of far-seeing in the future, predicting this stuff before it was possible, but already talking about it back then. So the positive view is Searles' theory of consciousness, that consciousness is a kind of a biochemical process, or it's dependent upon biochemical processes in the brain. So this is his attempt to reject that the mind is merely the software view, the functionalist view, without going full on dualist or bringing in anything anti-materialist. So Searle is a materialist philosopher. At the end of the day, he thinks that physics can't explain everything, but he doesn't think that. So one distinctive thing about computer programs, which is something that makes digital computers so powerful, is that you can implement them on any kind of hardware, right? So you could capture the same functional state, the same computational state that's realized in a brain with Tinker Toys or Lincoln Logs or Legos, right? I don't know. Maybe they don't. When I was a kid, you had Tinker Toys and Lincoln Logs. They probably don't make those anymore. But with Legos, right? It's at least physically possible, but obviously it'd be very complicated, right? whereas Searle's contending that there's something distinctive about our biochemistry, which explains that. Now, I don't think he makes the positive case for that very convincingly. I don't think that just by stipulating that it has to be carbon-based, for instance, complex physical carbon-based states, that explains why there would be consciousness, whereas it couldn't work with, say, silicon-based, or there couldn't be aliens with very different biochemistry that are nonetheless conscious. I don't think he makes that case very well. But I think the negative case against what's called the computational or functional theory of the mind is a good one, and essentially the heart of the argument is this distinction between syntax and semantics. So the reason that you can realize a computer program with any kind of hardware is that all that the computer program really is a syntax. It's got syntactic or merely formal properties. So you can think of syntax, the distinction between syntax and semantics, the easiest way to think about that is in terms of natural language. So syntax is basically the grammar. It's the rules for putting symbols together. It's just symbol manipulation, right? There are certain ways to form English words into sentences, and there are certain ways that, you can't put a period in the middle of the sentence, or you can't have a string of verbs and that be a sentence. So there's syntactic rules for how you put the symbols together. But that has nothing to do with the meanings of a sentence. So semantics is a matter of the meanings. So the heart of Searle's point is that computer programs is all syntax. We humans ascribe meanings we ascribe semantic content to the programs, right? Just as we do to language, right? We say the word tree means tree for us, right? It means those things outside, trees. But it doesn't have to. It's just a bare symbol. Computer programs are just really about rules for manipulating symbols. But our minds have semantics. They have semantic content, right? So the way that Searle illustrates this is this famous thought experiment where he says, well, so we can imagine a computer program that can take inputs of Chinese language and then has a sort of memory database with a set of rules that say, given these Chinese symbols, spit out in the output, these other Chinese symbols, right? And we can imagine it being so sophisticated that it could pass what's called the Turing test, which is to say that people, if this was sort of a black box and people didn't know if there was a person or not in the box, they wouldn't be able to distinguish between a computer and a person, right? So it would seem like this computer program was fluently speaking Chinese. Okay. Then the question is, does the computer program understand Chinese? And Searle's contention is no, because he says, well, just imagine this. This is literally the same thing. Imagine there's a room and you're in the room and you're essentially running the same computer program. So but we can keep it very low tech. And I think it's helpful to keep it low tech to kind of illustrate the point. So instead of having a laptop, right, you just have a big book of rules of Chinese grammar, as it were, symbol manipulation. So given certain inputs, so you can imagine a letter slot, right, where people from outside the room are inserting messages in Chinese to you. You don't understand a lick of Chinese. You don't understand a sentence of Chinese, right? But you look at the symbols. You then flip the pages in the book, which the book is in English, and it just tells you, given these symbols, output. Here's a list of possible outputs that you could give them back in the output slot. And if it's a really good book and you're good at this, right, of manipulating the symbols, the person on the outside wouldn't know that you're not a fluent speaker of Chinese. Nevertheless, you don't understand a single word of Chinese. So the point is that you are now in the position that the computer program is in. The computer program has syntax, it has rules for manipulating symbols, but it doesn't have semantic content. It doesn't understand. And so this is a pretty powerful argument to say that AI, no matter how sophisticated it gets, will always only be syntax and therefore won't have understanding, won't truly be conscious or have reasoning, because those things require semantic content.
So I think maybe as you were describing that, it took me back to, I think this is an analogy for the same idea. I mean, is the syntax versus semantic, is that the same idea as form versus content in formal logic?
Sure. That's right.
Like
Yeah.
when I taught formal logic, I remember we hit these analyzing sentences, and we could put sentences into standard form.
Right.
All A is B, or no A is B, and so on. And it didn't really matter what was in A or B. It could be all dogs are cats.
Right.
It doesn't matter. And then once you can manipulate those sentences in all kinds of ways. But the trick, the point, one of the things we kind of walk through is that no, there's a real difference between developing just a form, and there's a time when what you really need is a form.
Yeah.
But the content that goes in that form is something different.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. So logical form is a matter of syntactic rules. So all logic is, it's a formal language. And the reason that humans have invented formal languages is that natural languages like English are just really messy, and there's a lot of ambiguity in our meanings of what we mean, right? Whereas in formal languages, the rules of the syntax and the semantic rules are very, very precise, and so they're just easier to analyze logically. Sure. But yeah, that's exactly the same distinction.
That messiness of ordinary natural language comes into this, it seems. I may just be taking the Chinese room experiment too literally, but it made me think of my wife's frustrations. She's a middle school Latin teacher, and students will come in with their translations of a passage, and she can always tell who has used Google Translate because it has this, it's usually technically correct, but that translation misses the spirit of the sentence.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's something about language that's irreducibly messy, and that when you have a human translated passage, some of that messiness comes through the translation, and that's a sign of authentic translation.
Sure. Well, certainly if humans have bad grammar and the computer and the program has been designed to not make grammatical mistakes, and that's one kind of messiness. Right. But I take you mean something else, right? Which is there's a kind of subtlety to our intelligence that the computer program still isn't able to perfectly mimic. The really interesting, it's not just to disregard and downplay that point, because I think it's a good one, and it shows how far AI has to go. But I think the really interesting question is, suppose that gap will ultimately be closed, or maybe it's like calculus where we're always going to the limit, but essentially it's going to get to the point where, again, this one famous measure of this is, can these computers pass a Turing test, where an intelligent human being like your wife can't tell. Right. Ever, right? And presumably AI is going to get there, and maybe soon, given how impressive the advances are. But then the interesting question, so one, and getting back to the idea of sort of philosophical anthropology, the nature of the human person, and the need for us to clarify these deep questions before the technology is here, basically. I mean, one interesting way to kind of focus in on this is, at that point where the gap has been closed, what, if anything, will AI lack that we have? And I mean, Searle's Chinese room does provide an answer to that there won't be genuine understanding because there's actually no internal subjective point of view. And one way to understand the Chinese room experiment is, and one moral of the story, as it were, is that what the computer's lacking, we could say it's semantic content, but where does semantic content come from? It comes from precisely that hard problem of consciousness. It comes from human consciousness, and there's no reason to think that the subjective consciousness, that internal point of view, that there's something it's like from the inside to be a person. There's no reason to think that AI will ever have that.
There's another scholar from about the same time period, the 80s, I think late 80s, a guy named James Taylor wrote a book called Poetic Knowledge, where he tries to articulate the kind of knowledge that we get experientially and the way that experiential knowledge of reality gives rise to a perception of the connectedness of things. And he's really, in Poetic Knowledge, he's trying to make a case for really the value of literary study, in particular, for helping people see the interconnected nature of reality and of the human experience. And I think that's something similar to what AI literally can't get. Like there's something irreducibly human that can be grasped in that way.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely something that literature in particular captures, is some kind of knowledge that you can't get necessarily in other classroom experiences. You can get it in the real world, of course, but what literature allows you to do is, to some degree, experience what it's like, imaginatively through the imagination, learn what it would be like to have certain experiences that you haven't had yourself. And so that's a kind of knowledge that presumably AI doesn't have, but it doesn't even have to be as subtle as what's captured in great work of literature. I mean, it's just any kind of knowledge that can only be grasped experientially. So one of the, I've referenced the hard problem of consciousness a couple times. One of the reasons this is thought as a deep mystery, a deep problem to explain, is that it looks like there's a kind of knowledge which can't be explained in purely physical terms, and it's a kind of knowledge that you can only get through experience. And then the question is, why would that be the case if all of reality is supposed to be able to be described with these physical concepts? Ultimately, the social sciences are explained in terms of things like biology and psychology, and that's explained in terms of chemistry, and chemistry is explained in terms of physics, and physics is just mathematical equations, basically, and you get cause and effect in mathematics, right? You get structure and function, you get how things are put together in space and time, and you get cause and effect, and that's basically, those are your building blocks. The problem that consciousness poses for that worldview can be illustrated. There's a number of famous thought experiments, but one of them, my favorite, is you imagine a brilliant neuroscientist. The original story is this woman named Mary, and she lives in a black and white room her whole life. And she's got all these books learning about science, and she knows everything there is to know about the human brain, in particular human vision, and she knows about colors. She's heard theories about colors, that their properties on physical objects, and light hits the objects and then goes into your retina, and you have these experiences of colors. But she's never had experience of color herself because she's lived in this black and white room. So she wonders, what is it like to see red? And then she leaves the room, and she sees a red tomato for the first time. And she has the response. She says, now I know what it's like to see red. And so the question is, has she learned a new piece of knowledge? And I think the overwhelming temptation for most people, though people have different responses to the thought experiment, but is to say yes, that she learned something new that she couldn't possibly have known. But the thought was, well, hold on, we stipulated that she could learn everything there was about the physical facts from within the room, right? So those books contained all of physical knowledge, and not just of now, but future physics, let's say. So she knew all the physical facts within the room, but there was something she didn't know. So the world is made up of more than just the physical facts.
Maybe two follow up on that. Then we got to go to the other article you sent me, because we have to talk about the experience machines. That's really fascinating.
We're talking about experience, so yeah,
we are. The first piece, I'm curious. Have you ever read Lois Lowry's children's book, The Giver?
I'm ashamed to say I have not.
Well, I'm just going to recommend it as maybe something that you want to consider adding to your philosophy of mind syllabus if you ever want students to read a version of that experiment that's in a novel, because I'm pretty sure that either the thought experiment is inspired by the novel, or Lois Lowry probably took a philosophy class and then put that into her novel.
Yeah.
In the world of The Giver, which hopefully this is not a spoiler for any of our audience, because
or for me, for that matter,
or seeing the movie. But the world of The Giver is a post-apocalyptic dystopian future where all memories of the past are stored in this one man who is the giver, and he gets an apprentice named
Jeff
Jonas.
Bridges, I think.
Maybe.
I think in the movie. I didn't see the movie. Sorry, go ahead.
But Jonas is his apprentice, and one day when he gets his memory, Jonas discovers he didn't know that until that moment he had lived in a black and white world. Because in the memory, he first starts to see this quality that he can't quite describe, and it's a quality that it seems to have these different shades and this richness and this depth to it, and it adds something indescribable to this fruit that he knows is an apple, but suddenly it dawns on him that it is in fact a red apple.
Yeah.
And it's that experiential knowledge that in this case is, and once he sees it in his memory, he then can start to see it in the real world. And so Lowry's kind of playing with that, like, well, there's this cognitive awareness of the capacity that then relates to the physical capacity.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So so these are sometimes philosophers. You said you use the word qualitative or quality, and that philosophers sometimes call these qualia. So it's the what it's likeness. Sometimes is the phrase, right, of an experience, and it's not just vision, right? And so it's you can imagine the same story saying that he'd never noticed the taste of the apple before, right?
Sure.
Or the smell of coffee, or
right.
These distinctive things. How are we going to capture that in terms of information processing? There seems to be no good answer for that. So it's not something that can be captured in either functional terms or structure, and which means it can't be really captured in a mathematical language, which is what physics is described in terms of. And so it doesn't look like it's something that can be captured in terms of physics. So it looks like there really is a fact that like it's like this, right? And then you have the thing for it's like this to see red. Then that seems to be a fact about the world. Which goes beyond what physics can describe. So that in one fell swoop, I think, there's obviously great controversy about this, and there's responses from the other side, but that in one fell swoop, I think, destroys the sort of purely materialist view of the world and makes room for something beyond.
Well, I think it's something that's also been recognized for sort of almost intuitively for far longer than there's been a philosophical framing of the problem. Your explanation of Mary and Red also reminded me of the biblical language of a husband knowing his wife. That's of course the euphemism for sexual encounter, but that's a knowledge that's all. The King James version of the Bible framed that relationship in terms of knowing and a certain knowledge that there can be knowledge about marriage and about intimacy, but until there is that specific relationship, there is not that functional, that actual knowledge of the other person that deepens over time.
That's right. So one way this is, you actually have this in languages, so not so much in English, but I took 6 years of French, and I can't speak any French, I'm ashamed to say, but you have, I remember this much, that you have certain words for no, you have savoir and connaître, right? So, and I think German has the same.
Spanish has the same distinction.
Right. So this is sometimes explained in terms of a knowledge of things, and including knowledge of another person, right? Or what Bertrand Russell called acquaintance, that we're acquainted with the thing itself, including we could be acquainted with a red experience, right? So the kind of direct experiential knowledge versus a knowledge about facts, right? Which is, what most of sort of science and most of, what you do what you get when you read a book, whether it's a history book or science or so on. So maybe that's one way to capture that. There seems to be more things that we could know that could be captured in what's called propositional knowledge, that we could capture a fact, right? It doesn't look like what it's like to experience to know your wife, or what it's like to see red can be captured in sort of descriptive facts in that way.
Well, with that, let's turn to the experience machine, and I'm going to kind of read a selection from this. This is a very short 2-page article from Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick called The Experience Machine.
Yeah.
And I don't know if any of our viewers have watched Amazon's show Upload, but it's now in its 3rd season. I'm very interested to see how season 3 concludes later this week. By the time this airs, I'm sure season 3 will be over and we might be on to 4. But I think it's fascinating that Nozick wrote this in 1974. And he's basically describing the current, at least Amazon's current show as a possibility. That's not what he was intending, but that's where our cultural imagination is today. So here's his proposition. Suppose there were an experience machine that would give you any experience you desire. A super-duper neuropsychologist could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or reading an interesting book. All the time, you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life's experiences? If you're worried about missing out on desirable experiences, we can further suppose that business enterprises have researched thoroughly the lives of many others. You can pick and choose from their large library or smorgasbord of such experiences. After 2 years have passed, you'll have 10 minutes or 10 hours out of the tank to select the experiences of your next 2 years. Of course, while in the tank, you won't know that you're there. You'll think it's all actually happening. Others can also plug in to have the experiences they want, so there's no need to stay unplugged to serve them. And the question this all builds to, of course, is would you plug in? What else can matter to us other than how our lives feel from the inside? So there's the experience machine.
Yeah.
Dr. Forrest, what are your thoughts on the experience machine? What should we know about this thought experiment?
Sure. So it's usually thought of in the sort of first instance. This is a very famous. So it's 2 pages from this famous big book, but it's been anthologized all over the place. And you can also think about the Matrix, right? But the Matrix is a kind of dystopia, right? A bad thing. What's interesting about the experience machine is this is a utopia. This is you could have all the pleasurable experiences you could possibly desire. And I mean, you mentioned this Amazon show, but I think maybe even more sort of culturally relevant is the fact that Facebook changed the name of their company to Meta, because this is essentially, it's my understanding, and maybe I'm getting poor Mark all wrong, but I think this is Mark Zuckerberg's
Now,
dream,
let's just to clarify, you don't mean financially poor when you say poor Mark.
No,
I think poor Mark's living pretty large.
He's already been portrayed horribly, unfairly in that that movie.
Okay.
The Social Network, and so
Yep.
I'm sure he's a lovely person. But this is the dream, I think, of Facebook. I mean, talking about Elon Musk and some of these AI things, along with that, and of course these technologies could merge in various ways, right? But along with AI, the other big one is virtual reality.
Sure.
And so Nozick is just laying out the implications of that way back in the 1970s. It's usually portrayed that the kind of most direct purpose that this is put to is as a refutation of what's called hedonism, which is just a philosophical view. Of course, don't necessarily think of Panama City Beach and parties and whatever. Eat, drink, and be merry. It's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But hedonism is just the view that the only thing that's of ultimate intrinsic value in life is pleasure, or pleasure and happiness, depending on how we define happiness. And so this is the Nozick designs this to show that there's something missing with that account, because by stipulation you could have all the pleasurable experiences you might back yourself in the real world to say that your life is going to be better in the real world than in the machine. But most of us are going to be honest and say, no, my life in the real world is going to have lots of ups and downs and pain and suffering, and I can't control the kind of experiences I have. I can control that in the machine. And I've run this thought experiment with many classes of undergraduates, and overwhelmingly, now there are exceptions, but overwhelmingly, students say they wouldn't plug in. And this is not this crosses gender lines and socioeconomic lines, and it crosses religion. It's not like religious people are less likely to plug in. Overwhelmingly, people say they wouldn't plug in, which then raises the question. Okay, and notice in the machine, it's not just the promise is not just pleasure per se, right? But the promise is any kind of experience you want, right? So this suggests that we believe there's something to life that's more valuable, or that than just experiences. Or there are values that go beyond mere experience. And so the question is, what are those?
Well, in the second paragraph, Nozick has this line: we want to do certain things and not just have the experience of doing them. He then asks, but why do we want to do the activities rather merely to experience them? I was reminded of the North Carolina state motto, the Latin phrase "esse quam videre," to be rather than to seem. That this too is a long-standing philosophical principle that, and it goes all the way back to at least to Socrates, who thinks it is far better to actually be wrong than to seem to be right. At least to know that you are wrong is a better state of being than to seem right but actually be wrong.
Right. Yeah, so the distinction between appearance and reality. Yeah, Nozick has 3 things, and I think they're on the money. I don't think they capture all the reasons why people wouldn't plug in, and it's fun to kind of get students to list their personal reasons and see if they match up with things that Nozick or others have said. Nozick has 3 things. He says, we want to do certain things. So we could sum this up by saying achievement. So achievement is a value beyond pleasurable experiences that we care about. So we want to really win the Super Bowl as the starting QB, right? Rather than merely have that you could plug that into the experience machine, right? You could have the experience of being Tom Brady, right? But on some level, and of course, the part of the attraction of the machine is you wouldn't know when you're in the machine that you're in the machine, right?
Oh, sure.
So, of course, if you knew, then it's not the same, right? But you wouldn't know within the machine, but you know beforehand, and then the choice is to go in or not. And of course, maybe we would all go in if it was 2 weeks, right? But I mean, he tells it where you come out every 2 years. We could tell it in such a way that you never come out, right? But the point is you're committing to life, to live the vast majority of your life within the machine. You know ahead of time that it's not really going to be winning the Super Bowl or landing on the moon or curing cancer or writing an amazing novel. It's merely going to be, in a perfectly lifelike simulation of those things. So one thing is achievement, right? The second thing, he says, we want to be certain ways. So it's not just that we want to do certain things, but we actually want to have certain character traits. And it doesn't seem like in the machine, with everything sort of laid out from you, you could have the fantasy of being a brave person, but you wouldn't really be brave because the whole thing is planned out ahead of time.
The machine can let me, the machine can let me LARP, or live action role play, being Lycurgus for Sparta, but that doesn't actually make me a courageous king.
Right.
I'm just pretending. This really is just a form of costume.
Right. Well, and we can get creative here, right? So we can say, well, but maybe your imagination is too limited, right? We could, we could set it up in such a way that in the machine you have ups and downs in the story, right? And the machine is perfectly, so maybe it could help grow your character, right? You have to go through adversity within the machine, right? But it's hard to tell the story in such a way that it's not going to come off as either actually coercive on you. So it's sort of, you could set it up in such that the experiences are kind of pushing you into a certain kind of mold, or at the very least, very manipulative. And so one thing that's lacking here is, so one thing is sort of character traits and being a certain person. But even if you thought, well, the machine maybe can manipulate you into grow in a certain kind of way, it lacks genuine autonomy because you're being manipulated. And autonomy is one of those other things. Freedom or autonomy is one of those things that people say is a value that goes beyond, is a fundamental value that goes beyond pleasure.
I think that kind of coercion is really interesting, and it was. I agree with you. I did notice that was missing in this analysis, in Nozick's argument at least.
Yeah.
That shows up in the Amazon version, where the guy who's uploaded quickly discovers that everything in the digital afterlife is for sale. So all of his experience costs money, and his soul, if you will, is actually owned by his girlfriend, which creates all kinds of great comedic moments. You're like, wait a minute. He's gotten to the perfect afterlife, but he has to ask his girlfriend for permission to have a walk, and that costs $10, or whatever. Yeah. But it also
never sell your soul to your girlfriend.
No, it's just this good life advice right there. Don't sell your soul to really anyone, but especially not your girlfriend. C.S. Lewis talks about a similar phenomenon in Abolition of Man, where he looks at how every technological advance seems to promise an increase in freedom. And in a way, it does give that increase in freedom, but it doesn't give it by actually giving people the term you used earlier, qualia. Yeah. They don't get, the airplane doesn't actually give anyone the ability to fly. It gives a company the ability to create a product where they can sell me their ability to fly. Yeah. But in order to participate in the ability, I actually give control of my life for a short amount of time to that company. And that in such a way, all of the experience machine would also give control in a very real way to whoever owns the machine, whatever company is running this program, if this were ever to be realized.
Yeah, though that's obviously in any kind of practical way, this is a huge worry. And this is one of the many worries with the idea of the metaverse. And do we really want, if people were to increasingly upload into, and so this isn't the idea where we're literally taking the information in our brain and putting it into a computer program
right. We're floating in a tank.
We're floating, yeah. So your body's still there, and maybe it's being injected with nutrients and so on, so you don't float away.
Sure.
But
it's like Dune. It's a nutrient-rich gel, and I'm just chilling.
Right. But if everyone's doing this, and you maybe you're even interacting with other people within the virtual world, but yeah, there's going to be all sorts of immediate practical worries about who's in control of the virtual world and how much does it cost to have these kind of experiences. And like with AI, one of the things that immediate sort of practical problems is inequality, right? So we're going to quickly get to the point where there's the haves and the have-nots. We're just going to increase the amount of inequality in society, because who are going to be able to pay for these technologies? So human enhancement is another one, right? So we can genetically change so that your babies are more beautiful or more intelligent or more moral or more physically impressive and so on. Who's going to have the money to pay for that, right? And are we going to just multiply the inequalities that we already have in society? So, I mean, that's a worry, but you could imagine saying, well, we can get around that in some way, right? So, I mean, I think the more interesting thing for me is if there wasn't anyone who owned the machine. So, best case scenario, right? Nevertheless, would you plug in? And if not, why not, right? I mean, the other one, I mean, I do kind of want, I know you get to ask the questions. I do kind of want to know if you would plug in, and if not, why. But Nozick has one more, which is, it's a little bit harder to describe. I think he has got a phrase like, we want contact with a deeper reality. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, and some things maybe you think, oh, that's not really true. I mean, after all, reading a great novel in the machine would presumably be just as good as reading a great novel outside of the machine. I think so. I think the experience of hiking up a mountain could be just as good in the machine. But human relationships are obviously a place where this comes in. So at least part of what he's getting at is the value of truth and knowledge of the truth. So you might seem to have an amazing romantic relationship within the machine, but in fact, you're just having a relationship with a computer program, right? If you didn't know that, would you still, would it be just as good? And presumably most of us would say no. Even if you never found out that the love of your life was a computer program, it still would be better to actually have a human relationship with a real other person. And then likewise, that is applied to religion, right? So in the machine could only have the deepest truths that people know about, right? So, the like what's beyond, right? There is no beyond within the machine. There is no deeper truth, the deeper spiritual truths in the machine. They're just whatever the machine or the people who've made the machine have programmed in. Whereas, we believe that there are higher truths. So, I mean, I think that the idea of contact with a deeper reality is my biggest one, but I'm going to put you on the spot, Josh.
All right.
Would you plug in? And if so?
Oh, heavens no. I would not plug into that. In part for that third reason, but also because I'm a hopeless romantic. I really like Wordsworth's poem that starts with, oh crud! Now I said this.
Now you should never say it. It starts with that.
It starts with the world is too much with us late and soon.
Yes.
It's his meditation on industrial England and
getting and spending. We lay waste our powers. Yeah. Okay. Anyway,
he closes the close is really this just sad line about how we've gotten so much more out of science, but we've lost the Homeric wonder of seeing Triton astride with his wreathed horn. We don't see that anymore when we look at nature, and there's always been part of me that I love, particularly sunrises and sunsets. My wife and I will often sit outside on our porch and watch the sunrise before we both go to work in the mornings. And I don't think it's actually possible for a computer program could certainly make me feel as if it had reproduce the depth of color.
Yeah, you have the most amazing sunset.
But I look at that and I think that is literally God's handiwork of creating a unique blend in the sky for the joy of his creation every morning and every night. And the reality of that could not be replicated short of God doing that. So I think the most interesting argument to me about why the experience machine would be a lie is really not that it couldn't produce great feelings, because we can manipulate our feelings in really profound ways. But what it can't do is present any deeper truth than humans know, or any deeper sense of reality than humans have. And the people programming this machine, maybe hypothetically, they would be like the greatest, wisest humans who have ever existed. And that's probably not what would actually happen. What would happen is it's actually be a bunch of tech guys who are programming it. And their understanding of human nature is not great, and their understanding of reality is not great. So I would not do that. I've also always had just this internal bend that I keep referencing Socrates in part because I love Socrates' commitment to living not by lies. And this literally is a life by lies.
Right.
I'm probably also at this point pretty deeply impressed by the commitment Amazon put into the upload version of this, because they demand the in order to be uploaded, they have this brain scan that evaporates the head from the neck up.
Yeah.
So for the people that are going to be uploaded, like, this requires an absolute commitment. You're not coming back, at least until the 3rd season. But
Yeah.
So I'm like, no, I would not trade the embodied existence for some other version of existence.
Yeah.
How about you? What would you do?
No, I agree. I mean, it's so one thing you said, like, living not by lies. So again, the value of knowledge and truth as distinct from experiences. I mean, so one way to illustrate this, because I mean, usually you say, well, we want to know the truth because that's going to help us, or practically, experientially in the world in various ways.
But
right?
it does.
And it does, but you can design, and the experience machine sort of illustrates this. But you can come up with thought experiments in which you can imagine 2 lies which are exactly the same and how people would experience them, but one it's a lie and one it's true. So, for instance, suppose I have a long, very fulfilling, marriage. This is actually true, but yeah. So suppose, right, I have this long, very fulfilling marriage, 50 years, whatever, and she's my soulmate and makes me very happy, and she loves me and I love her, and then we die, right? Okay, that's one scenario. Scenario 2 is exactly experientially like scenario 1. So I feel this great love for this woman. I believe with all of my heart that she loves me. I never really have any deep doubts about that, and we live 50 years, and it's all the same from my perspective. But in fact, right, she's a KGB spy, right? She's, she just married me to get in. I don't know why she'd marry me. I don't have any important government secrets, but it's all a cover, right? For her to be in the United States. She disdains me. Right. She sneers at me behind my back. She cheats on me for not hundreds of years, but for decades, right? But I never find out. Right? So if I were to present you ahead of time, which of those 2 lies would you choose? It's a no-brainer that you choose the first one. Right. And it's not even, and you might say, well, if I give them the choice, of course I'd go with option 1, but it doesn't really matter, to the person. Well, but
no, I think it does matter, because in one of them, the core, there's a necessary betrayal at the heart of the second option.
Right. But you have to stress to the person, but you would never know.
Right. The knowledge of the betrayal doesn't matter. The betrayal is there.
Right. And so, yeah, so the suggestion there is, that we care about more than just first-person experience. We care about the truth, right? We don't want to live a lie. And it's not even like it's a coin flip, right? It's not like, well, maybe one is slightly better. It's obvious to everyone that you would choose the first over the second. So that's one reason why I wouldn't plug in, is that care about the truth. I mean, we didn't really talk about the importance of the body here.
Well, that's really where I want to kind of turn as we start wrapping this up, because I'm keeping an eye on our time, and we don't want to take too long lest we lose all of our audience. But so where does the body come into all of this after all this? I mean, it at least seems to me from this conversation that there is a part of the human experience that is embodied, that our encounter with the world. This is the part that, like, I did buy Hume's argument on. We do get almost all of our knowledge comes to us through the senses in some way. There's not much knowledge if any, that comes to us.
It's a conversation for another day, but I'll bring your premise for the time being.
In this sense, at least, that we get so much knowledge because we see, we hear, we taste, we smell, we feel. Those are primary conduits of knowledge for us, and that without the body, we really lose that. And we seem to lose something integral, something essential to what we are as human beings without the body. So with all that, what are your thoughts on the body, and where does the body come into this conversation?
Yeah, so big picture, I'm really interested in this because, like I said, I've been really interested in philosophical anthropology recently, partially because all of my sort of graduate study is in the philosophy of mind and some of the stuff we've been talking about, hard problem of consciousness and so on. But I realized that it actually has... It's not just, this is interesting to talk about the nature of the human person on a philosophical level, but I realized this like practical import for our time and these cultural controversies. And so the first realization was that, like I said, I think that most of the main controversies in our culture, deep down, are disagreements, at least in part, about anthropology. But the second realization was, and most of those disagreements, not all of them, but the vast majority of them, come down to a distortion about either the mind or the body, right? So there's an overemphasis either on the body or on the mind. So with AI and the idea that we could, the AI is going to replace us, I think that's a kind of materialist, a reductive materialist worldview that says that there's nothing sort of unique about our minds, about our souls. There's nothing supernatural about the human person, and so obviously we can sort of duplicate everything in the silicon thing over here that we have in a human person and can replace it. In fact, actually, the AI will get more intelligent. And so I think the Chinese room actually, in helping us to answer the question about what is AI still missing, helps us to correct that overemphasis on the body and say, actually, the mind and consciousness is really important. So my answers to that question are, morality and genuine reasoning, which are two things I think that are absolutely essential to personhood, right? Only happen through consciousness. So I think morality, you don't have morality without, this was a topic for a longer day, I'll just run through it very quickly, but you don't have morality without moral responsibility. Mm-hmm. You don't have moral responsibility without free will. And I think you don't have free will without genuine consciousness, and you don't have that without a mind, okay? Likewise, rationality, and this is the Chinese room point, you don't have genuine rationality without semantic content and understanding of that. It can't just be simple manipulation, right? So you don't have genuine rationality without semantic content. You don't have that without consciousness. And again, you don't have that without a mind. So the Chinese room corrects us by emphasizing the importance of the mind. The experience machine goes in the other direction. So hedonism and the view that experience is what makes life valuable is very mental. It's very first person subjective centric. And if you think, well, actually, my embodied existence outside the machine is valuable to me in a way that can never be captured within the machine, then that's a suggestion that your embodied physical existence has value beyond the experience. Now, why might that be? There's a couple of things, right? So what is this distinctive role of the body? So one is, it's the primary way that we interact with the world around us, obviously, right? So my mind's up here, but to realize my desires and my will, it has to go through actions that goes through my body. Mm-hmm. So the body is the way that I interact with the world, with other people, with the environment, and so on. And part of that is knowledge, too. The body, as you mentioned this with sort of the senses, the Humean view, the body is the way that I find out about the world, right? Because what are my senses except they're complex processes of causal interaction with the world, right? So I learn about the world by causally interacting with it. Also relationally, in some level, I'm relating. What I care about you is I care about your soul and your mind. And right, if your body was horribly maimed, I would still want to be your friend, right?
Well, that's good to know.
but when I think about you, what do I think of? In my mental picture, I see your face, right? So most directly, I'm interacting with your body, and of course, this is true particularly with sort of sexual procreation and with the family. And you think about childbirth and raising, all of these relational bonds of obligation, sort of mutual dependence and obligation, happen biologically. We have an animal biological existence. And then thirdly, in the Catholic tradition, you have John Paul II and the theology of the body, there are profound spiritual truths that are communicated through our bodies. The problem with all of those, this is my little theory here, I need to write this up in a paper, but the problem with each of those, and I think those are all good answers as to what's so important about the body. The problem is each one of those could actually be fulfilled by having an experience of a body within the experience machine. So it's not the real body, but the experience of a body, which seems to be valuable in each one of those ways. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's worth at least thinking about. So the real question is, what is it about my actual body that goes beyond merely the experience of a body, which is so unique and important? And my thought is that the real body imposes limits that the experience machine doesn't impose on you. And why are limits important? Limits are important because they help you grow in virtue. And why is virtue important? It's because part of what's unique about being a human, one other distinctive thing about a person, is that we have this desire to grow towards transcendent goodness. And that happens through the virtues. And I don't think you get virtue without trial and difficulty and challenge. And I don't think you get that without limits. And the experience machine is like this. It's like Satan to Eve and the garden, right? The experience machine is like, you can have all the great experiences and everything your heart desires without any kind of challenge or limits or you can have complete control over the situation, right? I don't think you can actually grow in virtue that way. With the body comes limits. I can't just teleport from here to Cancun, right? I actually have to, gotta get on an airplane, right? Obviously, if I want to have an amazing body, I have to work out and not eat the second piece of cake, right? The experience machine would give you this, would tempt you with this offer to short circuit all of that. Hey, you can have a washboard abs without self-control, right? But then you don't actually grow in self-control. Hey, you could win the Super Bowl or an Olympic gold medal, or you could become president of the United States, or you could have all these incredible achievements without hard work or without courage, overcoming obstacles and so on. So I think the experience machine focuses on this particular aspect of the body, which is its ability to impose limits on us, and it's only through limits that we grow in virtue.
Well, Peter, you've given us so much to think about. I'm looking forward to either some articles on all that material or hopefully a book. That sounds like a great book. I'd love to read it. On a different note, as we wrap up, I know you've been wearing your philosophy hat today. In addition to a philosophy hat, you're also Dean of Humanities here at Thales College. Just in case we have some philosophically inclined or otherwise inclined students who are listening in today, why should students come study at Thales College?
Sure. So we will get philosophy classes at Thales. Every student has to take a couple of my classes, whether they want to or not. But what's unique about Thales? I keep coming back to this knowledge and wisdom. So I think there are other places that are doing something similar, but we've got a pretty unique combination of, on the one hand, practicals or professional knowledge and skills that will make you a very competitive candidate, coming out of college to get a great job and have a great career. On the other hand, at the same time, without skimping on the liberal arts sort of foundational education, that's the wisdom side. So if you come to Thales, everyone gets both those things. Everyone gets an education, the classical liberal arts, the great books, where you sort of learn the sorts of things that we've been talking about today. You grow in wisdom and virtue, but also employable skills. We've got 3 majors right now that might grow over time, but in very practical professions. So in classical teaching, entrepreneurial business degree, and mechanical engineering. So someone comes out ready to get a job, but also hopefully having grown in sort of their character and wisdom. That's, I think, the unique thing about us.
Yeah, well, hopefully students who are interested will check us out at thalescollege.org if they want to know more. Dr. Forrest, thank you so much for joining me today on The Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thanks, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining in for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Peter Forrest, Dean of Humanities at Thales College. If you like this episode, please do leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.